The biggest problem we have today is nuclear proliferation, and having some maniac, having some madman go out and get a nuclear weapon. I hate proliferation. I hate nuclear more than any. My uncle was a professor at MIT, used to tell me about nuclear, used to tell me about the problem.
That's contradictory about Japan.
No. At some point, we have to say, you know what? We're better off if Japan protects itself against this maniac in North Korea.
Can you tell the Middle East we're not using a nuclear weapon?
I would never say that. I would never take any of my cards off the table.
How about Europe? We won't use it in Europe.
I'm not going to take it off the table.
You might use it in Europe?
No, I don't think so. But I'm not
just say it. I'll never use a nuclear weapon in Europe.
I am not taking cards off the table. They always say Trump wants Japan to, go nuclear. I don't. I really don't. But listen, when you have North Korea and you have Japan, and they're very close to each other, and frankly, we're sort of semi-involved. We don't want to be involved. At some point, it could happen anyway.
They said, I want Japan to nuke. I want Japan to get nuclear weapons. Give me a break.
A foreign policy expert on the international level went to advise Donald Trump, and 3 times he asked about the use of nuclear weapons. 3 times he asked, at one point, if we have them, why can't we use them? That's one of the reasons why he just doesn't have foreign policy experts around.
Trump asked 3 times.
3 times in an hour briefing, why can't we use nuclear weapons? With that.
Be careful, America, and be careful, Republican leaders.
So, General Hayden,
your party is blowing up.
I want to ask one more time, and and it may be classified, but the steps. Donald Trump decides to use a nuclear weapon. What is the time frame between his decision and when the nuclear weapons are launched?
Joe, it's scenario dependent, but the system is designed for speed and decisiveness. It's not designed to debate the decision.
North Korea has lashed out at US President Donald Trump, describing him as a destroyer who begged for nuclear war during his tour of Asia. Local media is reporting that North Korea's foreign ministry has said Trump's current trip to our surrounding region is a warmonger's visit for confrontation to rid the DPRK of its self-defensive nuclear deterrence. President Trump called on nations to stop financing and trading with North Korea while visiting Asia. Pyongyang says during Trump's visit, he laid bare his true nature as destroyer of the world peace and stability and begged for a nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula.
You're listening to TMI for the week of December 11th, 2017. Beyond Nuclear's Paul Gunter specializes in nuclear reactor hazard and security concerns. He has been a watchdog over the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, a critic of atomic power development for more than 30 years, and an environmental activist and energy policy analyst, recipient of the Jane Bagley Lehman Award from the Tides Foundation for environmental activism and his work on nuclear power and climate change issues. He has appeared on NBC Nightly World News, The Lear NewsHour, BBC World News, and Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Co-founder of the Anti-Nuclear Clamshell Alliance in 1976, which opposed the construction of Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant in New Hampshire, using nonviolent direct action that launched the U.S. anti-nuclear movement. Before joining Beyond Nuclear, he served for 16 years as the director of the Reactor Watchdog Project for Nuclear Information and Resource Service, NIRS.
How did your family get involved in this issue?
Well, I became involved with the whole nuclear travesty in 1975, actually.
Yeah.
With the proposed construction of the Seabrook nuclear power station on the New Hampshire seacoast.
Right.
And I was one of the co-founders of the Clamshell Alliance. And after seeing that all the whole bureaucratic process through the licensing in the federal government through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was all aimed at getting to yes to license nuclear power stations, despite the many, many hazards and unanswered questions and the known threats. We figured that we would take the heritage of the of many movements, social movements in the United States, going all the way back to the abolition of slavery, the suffragettes movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. Many of us were experienced in those last two social movements, to draw upon the resources of nonviolent civil disobedience. And so from 1976, when the Clamshell Alliance was formed under what was called the Declaration of Nuclear Resistance, we set about to politicize and publicly educate on the issue of nuclear power and its many connections to in the environmental hazards, the threat of nuclear accident, and ultimately the inextricable connection to nuclear weapons.
Was it as hard then as it is maybe today to get people to forget about their distractions and take this up as something they need to worry about?
Well, it begins with the process of public education. The issues back then were ironically not as clear as they are today, but we were still able to mobilize an anti-nuclear movement where initially I was involved in a nonviolent civil disobedience on August 1st, 1976, where 18 of us formed an affinity group with the support of a rally of about 250 people on the New Hampshire seacoast, and we deliberately walked out onto a construction site and occupied and rededicated the proposed site by planting of maple trees and corn and sunflowers, and refused to leave when we were confronted by Public Service Company of New Hampshire, and that refusal constituted a criminal trespass, and we were arrested. And by August 22nd, then it was 180 people that got arrested, and by April 30th, 1977, that number grew to 1,414 people organized in affinity groups, ultimately arrested on similar charges of criminal trespass and held in National Guard armories around the state of New Hampshire for up to 2 weeks. We coined the term "no nukes" with that movement, and that 1977 occupation essentially led to a number of different similar alliances around the country, including the Abalone Alliance in California to oppose the construction of Diablo Canyon, and the Shad Alliance to oppose the construction of the Shoreham nuclear power plant on Long Island. And it was really the Seabrook was the birthplace of the anti-nuclear movement on nuclear power.
The arrests really help you get notice in the news. That must have been the point of them, really.
Well, it certainly, that's the heritage of where civil disobedience, principled civil disobedience, has not only made the issue more transparent, spelling out our concerns, but which are picked up by the media, but also it's a word of mouth kind of transfer too, where you have a popular movement that then becomes educated and principled on the facts as we see them, and this was before 3 Mile Island. This was before Chernobyl. This was back in the day when the utility had actually laid claim to nuclear power is too cheap to meter.
Right.
And so all those principled actions and statements and politicizing the issue, not only on the environmental issues, but also the democratization of energy, as we still see the need today, where now we're faced still with an industry that far from too cheap to meter, it's too expensive to matter. And the industry and its champions on Capitol Hill and currently in the White House are still seeking to essentially take the economics of nuclear power and foist it upon the taxpayers and the ratepayers, even though the markets won't support it any longer.
Right.
So we're now in an era where it's clear that nuclear power is no longer sustainable, and its connections to still unresolved nuclear waste issues, and the clear and present danger of nuclear accidents is now demonstrated by 3 Mile Island near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Chernobyl near Kiev, Ukraine, and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accidents. Clearly these accidents are just going to continue to occur with greater risks and more frequency as these nuclear power stations age, and because of they're uneconomical. The industry is looking to take shortcuts and cut costs, cut corners, and reduce what they term as regulatory burden, but in fact has been a pattern of regulatory collusion with government and industry, essentially clearing obstacles from the path of nuclear development.
Right. I noticed that your website talked about a lawsuit that you're engaged in fighting a combined construction and operating license. We had the same thing here in Canada. Recently, the operator tried to do the same little trick, essentially granting themselves 10 or 15 years go ahead without the normal steps of regulatory oversight or public hearings.
Right. Well, the regulatory history of nuclear power, though, has always been and continues to be where the democratic process is truncated. The industry is able to lobby the regulator, and even through the purse strings of government, they can influence even good regulatory decisions. A classic example of that is one of the broad campaigns that we're currently involved in, following the Fukushima Daiichi accident, which was, these reactors there are these old, arcane, and antiquated General Electric boiling water reactors. These are 1960 designs. And when Fukushima melted down in that triple disaster of an earthquake, a tsunami, and then ultimately the nuclear meltdowns, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, its staff, in an obvious concern that these reactor designs were have been known since 1972 to be vulnerable to containment failure. And to the agency's credit, the technical staff, while they didn't come out with the more sensible conclusion that these antiquated and dangerous designs should be, the operating reactor should be permanently shut down, they did seek to impose some technical fixes that would have made the dangerous operation at least an iota safer by installing filtered containment vents. So they were going to, the staff, realizing that the containment could fail under severe accident conditions, requested that these GE boiling water reactors have these hardened containment vents be upgraded to withstand a severe accident, but more importantly, to install radiation filters on these hardened containment vents so that they could, while the weak and vulnerable containment could be vented at pressure, extreme temperature, and explosive hydrogen gas, the filters would still contain the brunt of the radioactivity from the severe accident.
So that's called the FLEX program, right?
Well, Flex is a little different. These were hardened containment vents that were filtered, but the industry, because it's operating on such an uneconomical margin, they were able to get to Congress, and Congress then threatened the federal regulatory agency's purse strings. Again, government, regulator, and industry colluded to not follow the technical study judgment of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they rejected the filtered component for the retrofit on these reactors. Again, the considerations were made to benefit the financial margins of the nuclear industry rather than public health and safety margins. And that's been the case all along.
Yeah. I thought it was telling that when you compare the arguments that the industry laid convincing us all to go ahead with this program in the 60s, the promise of containment, I find it ironic that the solution to a fuel accident is to vent at all.
Right, to deliberately defeat containment.
Well, that's when you need the
and
containment.
And the illusion of containment.
You need the containment.
I mean, ultimately, there is no containment when there are these routine emissions, which, we've known through epidemiological studies like the one that was performed by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health released in 1990 that showed a 400% increase around the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station in Plymouth, Massachusetts, another one of these GE Mark I reactors, a boiling water reactor that was traced to bad fuel that they operated the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station in. And, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health is no anti-nuclear organization, but in a peer-reviewed study, they demonstrated that even routine operations can lead to elevated cancer around nuclear power stations, which the Public Health Department concluded was related to both the proximity of residency to the operating nuclear power station and the duration of residency. So, but even so, ultimately containment's defeated when you have to do something with the nuclear waste. And now 75 years since the first cupful of nuclear waste was generated by Fermi atomic pile, Enrico Fermi's atomic pile, in the development of a nuclear weapon at the University of Chicago in 1942 for the development of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. We still don't know what to do with now upwards of 250,000 metric tons of nuclear waste worldwide. They're just talking about, the location from a nuclear power plant to unscientific geological burial. Here in the United States, they're looking at an earthquake-prone site in Yucca Mountain, Nevada, that's surrounded by the Lathrop Wells cinder cones. It's some of the youngest volcanoes in North America. Or to site nuclear waste storage along Lake Huron in Canada.
Well, we're very well aware of that.
Clearly these are not solutions. These are merely accommodations to the nuclear industry, which wants to dump its liability.
Yeah. I have a question. So we, after some treaties with Russia, the USSR, we got them to decommission some of their nuclear weapons. And I guess in the economic turmoil that happened after the collapse of the USSR, we wound up taking some of the material from these nuclear weapons. I understand.
Enriched uranium.
Yeah. So Trump apparently is talking about spending $1.7 trillion on upgrading America's nuclear arsenal. My question is it going to add to that those materials that we already don't know what to do with, or are they going to try to reuse the materials that are in the existing arsenal, or are we going to have to...
The issue of taking nuclear weapons for nuclear fuel, all it does is commercialize nuclear materials.
Right.
Enriched uranium and highly enriched uranium and plutonium need to be treated as dangerous, highly dangerous waste that will only serve otherwise to increase the trafficking of this material.
Right.
It gives it value rather than having being recognized as a threat to future generations long after the benefit of one single watt of electricity from these nuclear power stations has exhausted, and all the liability will be transferred to these future generations.
Mm-hmm.
The plutonium and the highly enriched uranium then will be prized.
It becomes an asset.
Part of the gambit that threatens all life on the planet right now, and it increases that gambit rather than going about a comprehensive program, essentially a Manhattan II project that looks to science, democracy, and peaceful solutions to managing this inextricable connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And commercializing it and trafficking it simply perpetuates the imminence of nuclear war and the future threat on generations that won't get any benefit, won't get 1 watt of benefit.
Has there been any talk yet? Back to my question. Do you know if when they replace the U.S. arsenal, they'll be coming up with fresh materials, or will they be removing those materials from the weapons and putting them back into new weapons? Because it just seems to be... I also noticed that America has been sort of stockpiling plutonium from Japan. It seems to all be shipped to Savannah.
There's more than enough nuclear materials now to destroy all life through nuclear weapons development. The key effort, and again, this was the Obama administration initially for making nuclear weapons, an innovation for nuclear weapons, miniaturizing nuclear weapons, enhancing the delivery systems. So I don't, again, this is the Trump administration is certainly perpetuating that, but the problem is intrinsic to both parties here in the United States, both Democrat and Republican, are again under this illusion that mutually assured destruction is a viable policy, and enhancing nuclear weapons, miniaturizing them, making their delivery systems more accurate. Again, this is it's just delaying the inevitable, that we will either have this all-destructive war either deliberately or by accident. And, so let's knock on wood right now, because obviously we are, it was always an illusion that the nuclear superpowers would not be able to contain the proliferation of nuclear weapons. It's clearly the case now with the increasing tensions with North Korea.
Right. When I've debated with pro-nuclear side about the connection between the weapon industry and the plants, they get very excited and insist that there's absolutely no connections. And up until was it the mid-'70s, there were even more obvious connections between the two. They've tried to erase them as best they can, but how can you paint a picture that illustrates the interdependence of the two?
Well, it begins with the fact that uranium is the common currency to a coin whose flip side is nuclear weapons and nuclear power, nuclear waste.
They start arguing that the sources are completely separate and that...
well, that's not true.
Yeah.
In fact, uranium is the common currency.
Right.
But the issue is just to what level you enrich it.
Right.
Nuclear fuel is anywhere between 3 to 5% uranium-235, but nuclear weapons grade material is upwards of 90% uranium-235.
Yeah.
Now, clearly the concern is that even though you are a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as was North Korea, for example, the enrichment process, while it can be under the guise of nuclear fuel for power plants, clandestine enrichment programs can then siphon off and redirect in a program that increases the enrichment of weapons grade. And so, the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself is essentially a gentleman's agreement that, as was demonstrated by North Korea, that you can agree on a handshake, but then the pursuit is it's just merely a political decision. But now we have the United States and Canada supporting India in the development of commercial grade nuclear power programs, but and then sustaining them with the technology. Clearly, India's now got nuclear weapons.
Well, yeah. So my little knowledge of the history on that is that under the promise that they wouldn't use it for weapons purposes, Canada sold them can-do technology or nuclear-related technology, and then India turns around in 1974 and explodes its first weapon. And then we had sort of not sanctions, but an embargo that only a couple years ago was lifted, and now we're back in business with India. And meanwhile, there's this arms race between India and Pakistan, I'm pretty sure we sold reactors to Pakistan. So we, in sense...
Yeah, clearly Pakistan, again, not a member of the NPT, but, you know, an exchange of 100 weapons between Pakistan and India will have global consequences that will essentially shut down agriculture all around the world.
Well, we up here in Ontario think we're, or Canada think we're all, a non-nuclear weapon zone, but we essentially, you can just look at the map and show the arms races that we've contributed to, and we all think we're quite innocent. Yeah.
Another connection is, and this one is just, clearly the demonstrates the inextricable connection that we have a government-operated electric utility here in the United States called the Tennessee Valley Authority, and they operate nuclear power stations, essentially Watts Bar in Tennessee is one example, where they're contracted to make tritium, radioactive hydrogen, through the U.S. government in a commercial nuclear power station, which is essentially a dual-purpose reactor, power and military. The tritium itself is used as to enhance a thermal nuclear weapon capability. That's the hydrogen bomb. That hydrogen presently in the United States is being generated in a commercial nuclear power station, Watts Bar. So there's a clear connection there between commercial nuclear power and military production facilities. So, but all along the way, they're generating nuclear materials, which will, again, the whole idea that, we're now trying to commercialize this dangerous material and are actively trafficking it around the world, gives it a value that ultimately leads to nuclear war.
Right. And so if they say, we're treating this nuclear waste to make it nicer, they're really removing the plutonium and whatever else they can get out of it, maybe some uranium.
And they're blending it down in the enriched uranium 235 to fuel grade, but in the process of burning it, that blended down U-235 in enrichment, you wind up generating plutonium, which then can serve as for hydrogen bombs, and in a much more powerful bomb.
Up here in Canada, our CANDU reactors are tritium pigs, and I'm surprised you guys aren't getting your tritium from us. We just make it hand over fist up here.
Right, and a lot of it going into the Great Lakes.
Right. I was going to ask you about the OPG-DGR, and then I noticed on your website you have today an article on it. So it's still being considered by our Minister of, I think it's the Environment, and that's just incredible. Right beside the lake, shafting down through an area that some people speculate in the next ice age will be gouged out once again. So you can bury it, but who's to say how deep will it be after the next series of glacial gougings that roll through?
And again, this is it's the short-sightedness of an extremely critical piece of the nuclear technology that's just an open-ended spigot on future generations.
Right.
It's really, we're talking about generating nuclear waste that remains a threat over geological spans of time. It's just astounding to me that when you look back over an equivalent of geological spans of time, the Great Lakes were part of an inland It was a sea. Yeah, it was. Lake Huron was salt water.
Yeah.
While that may seem irrelevant to our current society, it's the ultimate insult to stewardship of our planet.
My favorite part of that story, the DGR story, is that, on that site, they dig test wells, and they come up with 50,000 becquerels per liter of tritium in these test wells. This is the very muck they want to dig through. So they'd be digging all their tailings, raising them to the surface. The rain would be running it off. They say they'll contain the runoff, but, the lake in that area is around 20 becquerels per liter, where it should be around less than 2. Out when tested in the middle of the lake. It's already a disaster area. And why? Oh, and the other thing is that they spent 10 years with the country's most expensive scientists studying the site, but apparently not studying other sites. Who would put it there?
And that's clearly part of the undemocratic nature of nuclear power.
Right.
In that at every level, every link of the chain that binds us to this problem, beginning with the mining and the leaving behind of uranium mine tailings on indigenous people's land, and ultimately to the fact that the waste then becomes part of a forced location, a forced siting, doesn't even make an effort to go about a scientific process that would go through the motions of a process of elimination of what are the best and worst sites. So here, likewise, here in the United States, there's only one deep geological repository that's being looked at, and that's in Yucca Mountain, Nevada, and not because it's the best site, but because it's part of a political mugging.
Right.
Of the state of Nevada, that if you were to extend that geological characterization by a scientific process over many geological mediums, including granite or as well as volcanic tuff, you would immediately raise the ire and political opposition to the continued generation of this devilish stuff.
Mm-hmm. And I guess they're bribing them with host payments, I assume.
Here in the United States, the Western Shoshone have refused. They've refused to take bribes from the federal government, and they're trying to hold on to the Ruby Ridge Treaty, which again is they're looking the industry and the government are looking to violate that. It's not only an affront on things like treaties with Native Americans, but this designation of future generations as a dumping ground without any kind of scientific process.
And it's so permanent. Once you have a plant or a dump site, that's it forever. There's no going back. They plan to just put it there. It's got a lock-in effect. It's hard to get rid of once you've got it permanently. These areas get devoted to this storage.
They become national sacrifice areas.
Yeah.
That's the guise that it's hidden under now.
Yeah.
As if that makes it a better solution. But again, the industry was commercialized without a management plan for the nuclear waste. The industry was commercialized without a plan for managing nuclear accidents. Were it not for the Price-Anderson Act here in the United States, which essentially exempted the industry from any liability of a nuclear accident, there would not be one nuclear power station operating in the United States today or ever built. That collusion of government and industry that cleared the way for this commercialization, which, again, the peaceful atom was always a bomb, and it remains so today.
Our Nuclear Liability Act, up until about a year ago, the maximum liability was $75 million total.
Right.
Now they upped it to $1 billion.
Go ahead.
No, they upped it to $1 billion. But you guys, you're at 13.6 last I heard.
Right,
your
and the estimated cost of Fukushima is upwards of now $600 billion.
Yeah.
Chernobyl is well over $600 billion, and these are essentially guesswork of what it will ultimately cost. But no amount of money can ever address the long-lived toxicity of radioactivity that remains uncontained at these nuclear sites now.
I think the name Clamshell Alliance, I'm thinking some thought went into that, because if you're from the East Coast, digging clams, that's 3 generations of a family going and digging clams and steaming and melted butter, and it really connects you with the beach and the environment and the meaning of family and place. It seems like a great name for... It makes me wonder, other places, if they're going to start a grassroots movement and get people involved, they should put some thought into trying to bring home the what they're fighting for somehow.
Right, and I think that's the big affront that nuclear power represents, is that it makes no connection to the balance of nature, of living in harmony with ecosystems. But it's the name clamshell really was rooted in the fact that Public Service Company of New Hampshire, the initial licensee for the Seabrook Nuclear Power Station, they chose a site that was a clamshell heap of shells from the indigenous people that had settled in that area. And they made their livelihood was dependent upon a balance with nature, which included getting their sustenance from the ocean. So they, in living on the coast, their livelihood was connected to nature and the clams that they dug and ate, and then piled those shells right there. That's where the utility decided it would site the nuclear power station, as well as an Indian burial ground that they dug up and moved. But ultimately, there is no, this industry has no connection to the past or the future. It is relentlessly narcissistic in that its only goal is to generate power for now, and for the emolument of a class of men that have no regard for history or future.
And they don't like tree huggers. That's what they would call an anti-nuclear person, a tree hugger, who hates science. So this is grandfather's idea of how to generate electricity. I think for young people, we want to paint it as being old-fashioned. I'm trying to think of ways to get people more interested in it. So my question, one of my questions for you is, should we be trying to get more and more people feeling empowered and enabled to go to these public meetings that the regulators set up? Some argue as theater, but or should we leave space for experts like yourself to show up at these hearings?
Well, we work with community groups all around the country and actually around the world as well. Beyond Nuclear is initiating a new campaign called Beyond Nuclear International, which is focused on bringing personal stories of confrontation by individuals and organizations around the world opposing nuclear power, nuclear weapons, nuclear waste.
Mm-hmm.
And so by telling those stories, we're endeavoring to empower the personal story that motivates people like me for decades and for future activists to see that people power has an important role in shaping a democratization of energy.
Mm-hmm.
And engaging government, engaging innovative technology. But, there is a trend now. The trend is that you're absolutely correct that fossil and fissile energy is in the past. And it's no longer marketable in a sense that renewable energy, conservation, and energy efficiency, wind and solar are now cheaper than coal and nuclear.
Mm-hmm.
And without emergency planning zones, without national sacrifice areas, not connected to global destruction. So I think that the message for young people today is that it's time to get hip with the real energy policy of the 21st century, and to leave behind the mistakes of the 20th century. So I think it's really not just the market. This is the market trend now. But that doesn't remove the fact that this industry has always been effective in re-imaging itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now what used to be too cheap to meter, the peaceful atom, now they're reframing it as an answer to climate change.
Right.
And in fact, nothing could be farther from the truth. It is in fact going to deprive us of the resources and what precious little time we have left to make a consolidated, principled, scientifically based effort to put energy policy in sync with climate. And essentially by using wind, the sun, the tides, coupled with efficiency and conservation technologies that will provide us with at least abating the climate change from the mistakes that we've made with the fossil and fissile industries.
For show links and notes, visit tmi.twxnet.com. Email us, archer@twxnet.com.
Without having another accident, how can we make this a dinner table topic for families to get people talking about it? So there are, as you said, actions. I think in 1979 when they were protesting the Darlington nuclear plant, Greenpeace climbed one of the towers and they made it on TV. And these kinds of actions get on the news, but there must be You got to have some creative ideas, I think, these days. I mean, it would be wonderful if all these younger people with their phones would do that whole, there's a term for it, where they all show up somewhere in front of the utilities office building and have an event that gets some coverage, gets more people talking about it. But it seems like the public needs a little push to get them to realize that. And there are a lot of other things to worry about. But what's happening is that the nuclear industry just gets a free pass. They're like the ruling class, an unelected ruling class. Even politicians are afraid to ask the tough questions because they don't feel qualified. The industry has these public hearings. They say it's including the public in it. It's a democratization, but really people just grow old presenting before these hearings. I've presented before some regulatory hearings, and I've had a couple guests who have. I even had one guest, Dennis Riches, who translated a French play, and the play was about participating at hearings in France. So it's like this is a universal international strategy to almost keep the public stalled where they are. They put on this theater, make us feel like we're being listened to, and yet we just grow old before these hearings.
Right. Well, I think that the issue has to be put into the frame of just how antiquated nuclear and fossil fueled power is. There's clearly now an attraction to decentralized microgrids powered by the sun and the wind. It's being incorporated into our architecture now. The University of Michigan, for example, has now demonstrated that transparent coating on windows can be a photovoltaic conductive surface. And I think that part of the education now is that it's time to move away from what is brittle, what is vulnerable, what is dangerous, what is without stewardship, to readily available and deployable alternative energy sources, and to couple that with using less to gain more efficient livelihood. It's an interesting discussion when you realize that more energy in an incandescent light bulb is issued as heat than light. And therefore, antiquated energy systems relying upon lighting your home with incandescent bulbs, it's time to outlaw that because, particularly in summertime, you wind up using more air conditioning energy to cool the home down from the heat generated by this inefficient light bulb. Some countries are now outlawing incandescent lighting and moving to LED. But, this same kind of discussion is now happening at residential, commercial, and industrial applications for energy efficiency and conservation that are coupling decentralized rooftop or utility grade solar power systems. And, we're on the cusp of a major application of offshore wind where, there's enough wind out offshore well over the horizon, 18 to 50 miles out from the shoreline that is now being harvested in Germany, for example, in the United Kingdom, with an abundance of power.
It makes nuclear look just even more and more ridiculous all the time. Right, because they're flooding the market with this cheaper electricity, and it's harder and harder to justify the extreme costs of nuclear.
And it's not just justifying it any longer. It's not marketable. The only way nuclear power is going to survive is if, again, this collusion of government, regulator, and industry can take ratepayers and taxpayers and siphon our financial resources through an umbilical connection to this industry.
Yeah.
It's time now for everyone to take the irate payer pledge to resist nuclear power and fossil fueled power, where principled resistance takes the form of boycotts.
Right.
And beyond just a dialogue, an appeal to government, but active resistance.
One of my ideas is that on the back of the hydro bill, there should be some check boxes that say, I want my power from solar or wind or just in general renewables. And, you know, if it's all one grid, that sounds a little bit silly, but it should force the utility that if 20% of its ratepayers say, I want my power coming from solar, they have to match that up with 20% generation from solar.
Right. And here in the United States, you can, many communities are able to make that choice through their utilities. For example, here in where our organization is based, Tacoma Park, Maryland, the city of Tacoma Park has legislated by a city ordinance that all city facilities are powered by renewable energy, wind and solar. Likewise, residences and businesses are also able to take a green energy pledge to have, my home, for example, is 100% wind energy powered, where we've directed our checkbook to support the development and delivery of 100% wind energy to power our home. And again, these are community choices, business choices that are gaining momentum day by day in a shift that has already made nuclear power too expensive to matter. and again, without these tremendous bailouts that are orchestrated again by this collusion, the industry is phasing out economically, financially.
The new build VC Summer, that was canceled, or is it still being considered to be canceled?
VC Summer, the two Westinghouse reactors that were under construction there, are canceled. The struggle is going to be over of how the utility will recover its costs. These sunk costs,
right,
over $9 billion that they're trying to recover for an abandoned project.
Weren't they charging the ratepayers in advance for some of that build?
Through construction work in progress, but that's being challenged now. And right now we still have two nuclear power stations under construction. These Westinghouse AP1000 pressurized water reactors in Georgia at the Vogtle site,
right,
that are still, even though they are falling farther behind completion schedules and unpredictably skyrocketing completion costs, they're still lumbering forward.
What percentage of the way are they relative to the VC Summer?
35%.
So,
I mean, ultimately, these plants are not going to be completed, we're predicting.
Yeah.
But again, these are political calculations now. They're not market calculations. They're not financial considerations. Wall Street will not touch financing.
Nor will insurance companies.
Since the late 1970s.
Yeah.
This industry remains financially untouchable through the investment community. And it's only this orchestration of these permanent umbilical connections to ratepayers and taxpayers, fully funded by the government, that these projects continue to go forward anywhere around the world.
The collapse of Westinghouse and its implications for the AP1000, I mean, that was one of the factors at VC Summer, or was it?
Yes.
Okay, then why wouldn't it be true the same problems at Vogtle?
It certainly is weighing heavy on the increasingly difficult financial circumstance of the Vogtle construction project. Westinghouse was one of the world's largest nuclear suppliers. Bought out, it had changed hands internationally, ultimately winding up in Toshiba, which is fighting bankruptcy itself now, with a financial, the dominoes are still falling on the financial collapse of this industry, and corporations continue to lean towards bankruptcy, including Georgia Power, which is endeavoring to maintain bravado, this brave face for completing the Vogtle nuclear power stations. But Areva in France is financially collapsing.
Yeah, they get bailouts by the 10 billion quite regularly.
Yeah, and so these are the circumstances that are facing nuclear power. But again, governments are engaged in nuclear power development as part of this image of being a nuclear power, which includes possessing nuclear materials for nuclear weapons. This is one of the big concerns that's going on right now in the Middle East with Saudi Arabia pushing very, very heavily towards becoming a nuclear nation while resisting signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to renounce a plan for nuclear weapons development. Yet, keeping its own plan for enriching uranium, not only for nuclear fuel grade uranium, but nuclear weapons grade. And, there have been 11 countries in the Middle East and North Africa that have been looking and toying with the idea of becoming, the next new ground that the nuclear industry is looking to plow up. The United Arab Emirates.
Jordan.
Another one of these. They're very close. They're to completing the construction of 4 nuclear power stations, very close to in Abu Dhabi, near Abu Dhabi. I think the latest news is that the rebel groups in Yemen have claimed, though the UAE has denied, that a cruise missile was fired at the Barak nuclear power station, or I should say the Baraka nuclear power station in near Abu Dhabi. So again, the idea is that we're about to see this same industry re-imaging itself now in the Middle East, in North Africa, through this grandiose idea that there is this future as a nuclear power, when in fact what they're doing is they're loading up this extremely conflicted and high tension region of the world with nuclear materials, not only as potential for nuclear weapons, but each and every one of these nuclear power stations around the world, in fact, is a pre-deployed weapon of mass destruction.
I call them self-installed landmines. We don't see nuclear power plants in conventional war theaters very often.
Absolutely. And this weekend may have been a demonstration of how vulnerable these nuclear power stations are to either external events like a cruise missile or internal threats by insider sabotage.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true of every one of these nuclear power stations.
One of the things that I always found interesting relative to the Fukushima accident was, well, we're not going to get a tsunami here, but people don't really realize all you need is a station blackout to continue for, 14 hours, and fuel starts heating up. And so you don't need an earthquake, you don't need a tsunami, you need to lose power, and the clock starts ticking on total disaster.
Right, and that goes back to the Flex program you mentioned earlier. The industry thinks that they can remedy station blackout by bringing more batteries, more generators on site and securing them so that they, have that increased defense in depth from both direct current and alternating current generation sources. But here in the United States, we have 35 nuclear power stations that are located below huge dams that are part of a deteriorating infrastructure here in the United States because of just the lack of attention to, and lack of resources. So we could have an inland tsunami related that to an earthquake or a dam failure or an act of sabotage that could replicate the same kinds of situations in the interior. Likewise, the same threat of a dam break below the nuclear facility would drain the cooling water resources away from the nuclear facility,
right,
and thereby a loss of coolant accident. So, and all of these nuclear power stations are located they have to be on large resources, either reservoirs, dams, rivers, lakes, the ocean, where, they're relying upon water to remove the tremendous amount of waste heat that's generated by these facilities. A nuclear power station, in the fissioning of the atom, only 33% of the heat generated goes to steam.
Mm-hmm.
The other 67% has to be removed by the process of direct cooling, by drawing in tremendous amounts of water, in some places, over 1 billion gallons of water a day, or evaporating tremendous amounts of water through closed cycle cooling. But, nuclear power relies upon this incredible waste
right
of our precious water resources that are going to become more and more problematic.
They're as efficient as these light bulbs you were mentioning, where most of the energy gets turned into something we don't
Absolutely.
want.
That's exactly the precise comparison. Most of the heat is wasted, or actually becomes a hazard, because if it's not managed, it develops into fuel damage, and you move towards nuclear accidents.
A lot of talk, and certainly a lot of advertising, especially here in Ontario, telling us how green and clean, and they still advertise it's cheaper than wind and solar, and all this ridiculous stuff they say. And yet, a long time ago, at the high levels, a lot of the policy has shifted away. So wasn't the United States sort of planning on 1,000 reactors, and then by the time TMI occurred, 3 Mile Island, at high levels, you guys stopped building plants.
The financial collapse,
yeah,
the financial meltdown of the U.S. nuclear industry occurred before the 3 Mile Island meltdown.
Right.
The last nuclear power plant ordered in the United States was 1978. The 3 Mile Island accident happened in 1979. Right. And no nuclear power station ordered after 1973 was ever completed.
Someone seems to get the message, even if all the propaganda that we hear, maybe in social media and certainly by the pro-nuclear lobby, and definitely by the ads, make it sound like, all's great. But but there does seem to be, at the higher levels of the decision-making, change in acknowledgement that these accidents mean business. Maybe it's just the basic economics of it that.
Well, again, this industry is remarkably effective in re-imaging itself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there have been many collapses of nuclear power, you know, following accidents, the financial meltdowns, and they have re-imaged themselves as friends of polar bears, for example.
And they come out, after every accident, they come out with a new design that will be meltdown free and
absolutely,
you know,
and ironically they're the same old thing.
Yeah. These small modular reactors. This is another thorn in my toe here. Essentially, they just want to save the wire, build it closer to populations, and it doesn't have conventional containment.
Right. Well, that's like the pebble bed modular reactor,
yeah.
which operates without containment. The fuel, the pebbles, these ceramic balls about the size of a tennis ball. Each one of those fuel pebbles is its own containment.
Huh.
But with all the, you know, the case with each and every one of these SMRs is that they first need to build an assembly, essentially a massive assembly line without any orders.
Right. There's no economy of scale. Like, you know, they can't make money off a 50-ton reactor.
Yeah. You know, they initially had promised nuclear power would be affordable through an economy of scale. Now they have, again, now they're re-imaging themselves that at the economy of scale will be at a factory, and we'll just churn these things out like Henry Ford.
Mm-hmm.
And again, somebody is going to make a massive investment, likely government, if these things ever get off the ground, without any orders.
And then we'll be seeing nuclear waste trucks like garbage trucks rolling down Main Street. Yeah. Nuclear waste will be ubiquitous if we have small modular reactors.
Right.
That's not a pretty future.
And it's not proliferation resistant either.
Right.
So you essentially just wind up with the same problems. And in fact, reactors like the pebble bed modular reactor, you wind up with greater volume of still dangerous and non-proliferation resistant nuclear waste.
Same old nuclear waste.
You just get a bigger volume of it, which means bigger repositories.
Now, last I heard, the U.S. had 70,000, it must grow every year, but 70,000 tons of just spent fuel.
I think it's 72,000 tons now.
It'd be interesting to have a total tally on because in Canada we've got high level and intermediate A and intermediate B and low level and spent fuel but what, you know, when you start adding the tailings from enrichment, the tailings from mining, the total is an inconceivable amount.
It is. It's deliberately hidden.
Yeah. Much like the costs.
Exactly.
Yeah. I had some of these other people who have presented at public hearings on. I was trying to steer the conversation in a way that made it seem doable, that you get up and you go to one of these meetings and you make your voice heard. I know, speaking from experience, it's an incredibly terrifying and intimidating experience, and it's probably a long shot getting people confident enough to go out and do that. But maybe other people have suggested that politicians are the targets they should be speaking to. Obviously, people they know, organizing, you know, actions that would get people thinking about this more.
Well, I think that you know, one of the actions that we're supporting in Canada is to make the public aware of the threat of nuclear accidents, and to make people more and more aware, particularly around nuclear power stations there in Canada, how to engage their local authorities, broader community in topics like emergency planning.
Yep.
Canada right now is, in fact, as a result of the Fukushima accident, became acutely aware of how you could educate the community about the threat of a nuclear accident by talking about the pre-distribution of potassium iodide.
Right.
And in fact, that has influenced the utilities and the government to pre-distribute potassium iodide around the so the potassium iodide is in homes.
Right.
It makes the topic
Mm-hmm.
of nuclear accidents again part of the dinner table. You don't want to cast it as an anti-radiation pill, but it does put the whole issue of emergency planning into how we must take responsibility for the technological realities that are here today.
Mm-hmm.
It is engaging government and utility about taking responsibility, but it doesn't eliminate the threat. It, in fact, illuminates the threat
Mm-hmm.
because radioactive iodine is only one
Of hundreds.
radioactive isotope
Yeah.
that would be released with hundreds of radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 or strontium-90, with which you don't have that kind of protection.
Yeah.
But it does lend to the conversation of you have your potassium iodide to protect your thyroid and the thyroid of your children while you permanently leave your home, business, and economy behind
Mm-hmm.
in the evacuation process. And again, it's part of this broadening of the dialogue by taking specific actions that then raise these broader questions and concerns.
I was talking to a girl in a hardware store. I don't know how this came up. And she told me that when she was a kid, the pills came to the house. And of course, that got her and her friends all asking questions about it. And they, without the help of another organization, went out in their neighborhood harassing the neighbors, like knocking on doors. And I think they printed themselves up some little pamphlets and stuff. But there's kids on their own initiative going out just because these pills showed up at the door. So you're right. It does get just everybody talking about it. Well, a concern here is that in the GTA, we call it, surrounded by nuclear power plants, it's 5 million of us. And we don't get the pills because we're not in that radius.
Well, that's part of the discussion now is that the pre-distribution zone needs to expand. Yeah. And not only should this pre-distribution of potassium iodide now expand, broader than just prophylactic protection from radioactive iodine. You need, in these emergency planning zones, to start the discussion about having thermoluminescent dosimeters similarly pre-distributed into everyone's home so that in the event of an accident, you can actually measure exposures.
Right.
So it's now the responsibility grows from prophylactic protection from 18 kilometers out to 36 kilometers and beyond, but also now to deploy radioactive film badges so that you can actually see what's otherwise without taste, without smell, without feeling, but clearly a danger to biology. But again, it's about taking the discussion and growing it with positive, real actions that are based in what the community should have been delivered to begin with.
Mm-hmm. It's always amazing when I hear of the emergency planning. So we start with shelter in place, and then the Ontario Fire Marshal pointed out how that's not possible. You can't seal your house airtight. You, especially if it's negative, 20 outside, you can't run your furnace, or it's just not a practical solution, sheltering in place. And then your dosimeter reminds me that, the whole thing is all dependent, even the KI pills, on quick dissemination of information by the authorities. And the reality of that is that as soon as anybody hears word there's a problem at the plant, we're all on the road. I mean, all you have to do is be in a rush hour to realize it's not been thought out properly. It's not, I don't think it's possible.
Deliberately. Well, it actually has been thought out. They just are hiding their thoughts.
Right. Ooh, that's dark. Is there anything that you want to mention that people should be looking at on Beyond Nuclear?
To anticipate the initiation of our Beyond Nuclear International,
right,
which will certainly be looking to illuminate stories in Canada as well as elsewhere around the world.
Right. It's all the same thing, no matter what country you go to. It's the same thing. There's this regulator in bed with the very entities they regulate, escape plans that make no sense, policies that are continue to be conveniently blind. It doesn't matter if it's American or French or Japanese or Canadian. It's the same issues.
The personal interest stories,
right,
are unique in how citizens are taking action around the world, taking responsibility for shifting energy policy, for democratizing energy through renewables and efficiency and conservation, and how people's courage is making all the difference.
I can't thank you enough for giving us this time.
Okay, well, thanks for giving us a call.
Paul Gunter joined us from Maryland. Beyond Nuclear is based in Washington, D.C. Beyond Nuclear is dependent on donations. Find their website at www.beyondnuclear.org. Their webpage is an amazing look at the issues, often as they break. See the link to their fact sheet page at Beyond Nuclear listed in our show notes, and the many sources and resources listed all the way down the left-hand frame of the Beyond Nuclear website.
And for your information,
Manu, what are you learning?
Elijah Cummings, the top Democrat in the House Oversight Committee, says that he has a whistleblower prepared to make some statements to the Republican chairman of the House Oversight Committee about Michael Flynn, the fired former national security advisor. Now, according to this whistleblower's account, on the day of President Trump's inauguration, Flynn had texted a business associate about a plan to join Russia in building some nuclear reactors in the Middle East. And he said that this project was, quote, good to go. And one reason why, according to this whistleblower's account, was because the administration was prepared to rip up sanctions with Russia. Now, this is the strongest indication that we have to date that Michael Flynn and the administration perhaps was moving towards easing sanctions on Russia, and also that Flynn had a personal motivation himself to move forward with such a project because presumably it could help him financially.
This has been TMI.